Hey everyone, this is part number 2 of our discussion with Penn Hill Vice President Lindsey Fryer. It picks up right where we left off in part number 1. Welcome back. So the Obama administration under Secretary John King had to write regulations, we call them in Washington, around the law. Those regulations wound up being a hot potato, kind of back and forth.
Yep.
And Congress wound up using the Congressional Review Act a couple months back to strike down most of those regulations. Can you talk a little bit about what were the regulations, why did they become controversial, and what do you think of the decision to use the Congressional Review Act there?
Yeah, so the regulations, I'd say, largely dealt with the main provisions of the law, which is accountability, standards assessments, school improvement. The regulations looked at what was in the statute and added more clarity in some places, more parameters in other places around how states had to address the specific aspects of the law. And that is the executive's role. It is their role to use regulations to clarify the law where necessary. I think the issue with the Congressional Review Act is that the Republicans in Congress, and some Democrats too, although ultimately they didn't vote for the CRA, did feel that in some places the administration had gone too far in adding more parameters or more restrictions in the law than was intended by Congress. One example of that would be the weighting of indicators, which I had talked a bunch about on this video thus far. The regulations, as I mentioned, all the law said was each of them academics have to be significant, and in the grand scheme of things, in the aggregate, way more than non-academic indicators or other indicators of school quality. The regulations basically had states had to do 3 tests to prove that was the case, that these academics outweighed the school quality indicators. And essentially it rendered the school quality indicators meaningless and accountability, because you would be a school identified for improvement if you did poorly on your academics, but then your non-academics or school quality indicator could never pull you out of identification, essentially. So, it felt that like what was intended to be flexible became very inflexible. And just a lot of places where Congress said, states, you decide how to define certain terms or how you want to spend your money here, or like what's important to you, and picking your priorities. The regulations added a lot of new parameters within those areas. So, I think Republicans felt that they wanted to repeal those regulations, and that this was a rare opportunity. I mean, CRA had only been used one time before, and from a political standpoint, I think it was a move that Congress had to take. The Republicans had just taken the presidency. They had full control in Congress. Why would they keep old regulations on the book when they could have a chance to kind of
Do you think they were right to use CRA to get rid of those regs?
Yeah, so, I have mixed feelings on this. The way that a negotiation works, there are some aspects of the law that you leave ambiguous because it's very difficult to negotiate and come to a compromise. So there are some terms that you come up with that aren't loaded politically, and sometimes there should be a little clarity given to some of those terms. But the clarity is important, but clarity at the cost of what? Like, clarity does not mean more requirements, more parameters. So, in some places the regulations did help. I think they gave more flexibility in some areas than the law actually provided. But in other areas they went way too far. So I think I went back and forth personally about whether or not I thought CRA was a good idea. But what I will say is, with it gone, with the regulations gone, there's an unprecedented opportunity for states to really design their systems, and there's systems for accountability, and there's no longer like an excuse to blame the federal government when things go wrong.
So states are starting to write these plans. You've talked to states as they're doing this.
Yeah.
Some of the state plans have been submitted. What do you think of them so far? Are they promising? Are they not promising? Are they just paper and it's hard to say anything yet?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to say at this point. There's a lot of gaps in the plans that have been submitted. Many states haven't set goals for what they want their students to achieve, which was a main tenet of the law. So, I think it's yet to be seen how these plans play out. My hope was always that with new flexibilities and new control, that there'd be a lot of innovative things that emerge. I think states are a little scared to kind of go out on a limb at this point because they're so used to the department saying yes or no to every decision that they had to make in education. So, it's yet to be seen if huge new things are going to emerge that we haven't seen before. But the plans do matter in the sense that this is how you apply for your dollars, and there's a new aspect of transparency that the old law never had, where the public's going to be able to take a look at these plans, comment on them. They're very, very publicly available. So let's let the public decide and be the deciding factor here.
So if I'm listening to you talk about it and I'm just watching this, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, these plans, these goals, this was like no NCLB. It feels a little bit like Soviet 5-year, like farming plans. We are going to grow 10 million more metric tons of crops.
Yeah.
Like, how much should we actually care about whether states say 5 years from now, like magically students are going to be able to get to? Is that an important part of helping states kind of actually improve schools, or is this a bunch of bureaucratic busy work?
So I think that it's important to set a goal for something to reach to and strive towards, because otherwise, what are you working towards? Like, you have to measure whether or not you're making progress. I think that's an important thing that we learned from No Child Left Behind. We got better data about how students are doing. The issue with goal setting, it depends on how seriously states take it, right? What if a state says by 2035, I'm going to have 19% of my kids proficient? Well, that seems a little ridiculous. I think it's yet to be seen how important these goals are. But I think a lot of states are thinking like more near term. What do I want for this school year or these next 2 school years versus my long term goal of whatever that might be. I think states are, from what I've seen, taking that fairly seriously in terms of their discussions, although they might not be down on paper yet. I think from a perspective of allowing the public to say, are our schools doing the job that they're intended to do? There should be goals that people are striving towards, and there should be some accountability for whether or not schools are achieving those goals.
What do people not know about ESSA that actually is important?
So I mentioned a lot of flexibilities that weren't in the law prior in terms of moving your money around. There's interesting provisions like weighted student funding, a weighted student funding pilot, where states are experimenting from what I've learned about how to allocate their own state and local dollars in unique ways, so where money is given to kids based on their characteristics. So are they an English learner? Are they homeless? Like, money is actually tagged to unique characteristics, and they essentially the money does follow the child to the school that they attend. The federal dollars don't flow that way, and there's a unique ability now for districts, if they want to apply to the secretary, to say, actually, I want my federal dollars to flow that way, and the way that my state and local dollars are flowing. So I think it'll be interesting to see, since more districts and states are interested in this type of funding, if they take advantage of a flexibility that the law has. And then one thing in terms of process, like getting away from content, I think one of the biggest things I learned in this negotiation was like how hard compromise is and how hard it actually is to get a bill through Congress, and all the different like little points along the way that can really like.
So say more about that, because right? I mean, you watch this stuff and you're like, man, I can't possibly be this slow. Like, what are a couple of like things that come to mind when you try to explain to people like why it was so hard?
Yeah, so I mean, the number one thing in the Senate, in terms of the makeup when ESSA was moving, is we needed Democrats on board. Republicans were in the majority, but we needed Democrats on board to usher the bill through. We didn't have 60 votes. So from the beginning, I think our expectations were set that we need to figure out a bipartisan compromise, and in the Senate, that means like every single senator, each of 100 senators has their own voice that can stop the process at any given point along the way. I mean, you start with the committee, the HELP committee, which is in charge of education policy, and putting forth a proposal to move to the full Senate. We had to get everybody involved because everybody has an opinion, and education is just that way. Just because someone went to school, they think they're an expert in education. So we had to manage all these different viewpoints, to make sure that everybody felt that their voice was heard. And as soon as people started to feel like their voice wasn't heard, they could stop the process in the Senate. So, you start with committee, then you move to the floor, then you move to conference where the House and Senate come together to compromise, and then you have to repass everything again. So it's a very difficult process and very time consuming to make sure that you're constantly listening to feedback that you're getting and incorporating it in the best way that you can without hitting any holes that could completely tank the bill. And then there's outside issues completely not within education that if senators are upset about on one day could come to the floor and stop the process from the bill moving. So
What are some of the complaints or pushback you heard that were more surprising? That before you worked on Capitol Hill, you wouldn't have thought these people would be complaining about this or something?
So I'll flip that question a little bit. I think actually what we heard was the process in the Senate is always so convoluted. The deals are done behind closed doors and the senators never know what they're voting on. So because we had heard that for so long, what we as a committee tried to do was meet with every single office, tell them about the bill, tell them about their opportunities for amendments, and really let them know what they were voting for. So the criticism of Washington being this black hole, full of backroom deals, we actually brought that out and said, actually, we're going to do this fully transparently. And that made our lives as staff a lot more difficult because everyone knows what's in the bill, everyone knows what they're voting for, they're analyzing every word, and again, if they don't like a word, then they can say, I'm done with this. But so we took the tactic of transparency is better, being open is better, and in the end, it was true because we were able to move a product.
So, given that, if you're talking to folks who are working on Capitol Hill now, or working this stuff in states, or working in school boards, are there a couple of takeaways for you, a couple of things you've learned about how to write legislation, how to try to pass legislation in a way that you're more likely to get where you want to go?
Mm-hmm. I'd say one thing I tried very hard to do as the staffer kind of handling this process was not saying no to every idea that came across my desk. So it's very easy when you know something's controversial to be like, we're definitely not doing that. And sometimes you just have to say no. But what I tried to do was, being that I knew I had to manage all different member priorities, many advocacy group priorities, from the unions to the civil rights to the conservatives, I'd look at the proposal and say, all right, maybe we can't do this exactly, but this theme is something that we can explore, and then work with individuals to put some ideas into legislation that other people might have just said no to. And that was a really important lesson, I think. Compromise is the only way to get these things done, and compromise is really hard, but it's really important to listen to people and try to come to a yes rather than just say no all the time.
And last question. So that's the importance of compromise, but you also pointed out earlier that when you're writing these things, and sometimes you just leave it vague or fuzzy to get compromise. So when you're passing a big law like this, how do you think about making sure that those compromise and that fuzziness doesn't get the law passed, but yield a law that's confusing or frustrating or unhelpful for schools and educators and kids?
It's a great question. I think from the beginning, Alexander set forth for his staff principles that he wanted to accomplish, and I set those out in the beginning: state and local control, reducing the high stakes around testing, making sure the secretary couldn't interfere in education, and so I always had those principles in my mind as I was negotiating, and I felt that as long as those were being met and I could go back to him and say, this is the agreement that we came to, this is how we met your goals, and it's better than it was before, that was a win. And so, certain areas and certain words, words absolutely matter, but having the bigger goal in mind and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, I think was my guiding light in the negotiation. And I felt that gave us a product that is actually good for educators, kids, states, and districts across the board at the end of the day. And largely because it gives them the opportunity to shape education versus me as the policymaker, right? So I think that the details absolutely matter and they're very important, but I think keeping your principles in line as you're negotiating and making sure that you can't compromise on these things, but you can on these things. That's how you get legislation done, and it ended up in a pretty good product, I think.
Cool, Lindsay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, that's the end of our discussion with Penn Hill Vice President Lindsay Fryer. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint, and be sure to check out the rest of our videos and research from AEI.